South African Development Community dedicated October the 25th as Anti-Sanctions Day in solidarity with Zimbabwe, which faces illegal and unilateral sanctions imposed by Western countries led by the United States. Now, to mark this day this year, Zimbabwe's president addressed the nation and started by explaining the background of the sanctions.
It is now 2 decades since our great country was slapped with unilateral, illegal, unjustified and unfair sanctions following our decision to repossess our land grabbed from us by the minority white settler colonialists.
Hello, I'm Mubarak Henia and a warm welcome to Africa Today, a weekly program which gives you an alternative view of events making headlines in Africa. This week we are focusing on US-led sanctions on Zimbabwe and how they are impacting negatively on ordinary people. In the second part of our program, we shall see how mostly American chocolate companies are involved in perpetuating child labor and slavery in West African cocoa plantations. Stay with us and send us your comments through our social media handle as you watch.
US-led sanctions hurting Zimbabweans. The illegitimate sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe by the United States and some other Western countries have lasted for 2 decades. The sanctions were imposed after Zimbabwe started a land reform program which saw indigenous people repossessing land that was occupied by European settlers during the colonial rule. The ensuing unilateral sanctions have gravely affected Zimbabwe's capability to develop and improve people's livelihood. A Zimbabwean protesting the illegal sanctions speaks on how innocent people are suffering.
Although they are said to be targeting a few, they are hitting the majority. So sanctions should go. We have suffered enough. The whole region is supporting us on our side because sanctions are hitting the poor majority of this nation.
Alina Dohan, a United Nations Special Envoy, has called on the United States and other Western countries to lift their sanctions on Zimbabwe. She says the restrictive measures are making ordinary people suffer. She made the call after her 10-day fact-finding mission in Zimbabwe and added that sanctions violate human rights obligations.
I'm concerned that existing unilateral targeted sanctions as a punitive action violate, at the very least, obligations arising from universal and regional human rights instruments, many of which have a peremptory character. In particular, procedural guarantees and presumption of innocence, with a view that the grounds for their introductions do not constitute, for the most part, international crimes or comply with the grounds for universal criminal jurisdiction.
Now, for more on how the US-led sanctions are hurting ordinary Zimbabweans, we contacted Alina Dohan, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures. Thanks a lot for your time, madam.
It's a pleasure.
Now, you visited Zimbabwe last October to assess the impact of sanctions. Can you tell us your first-hand experience of how the US-led sanctions are hurting ordinary Zimbabweans?
First of all, it's necessary to make the point that that's not only the United States which is imposing sanctions against Zimbabwe. There are a number of other countries. In particular, there are sanctions in force implemented by Canada and Australia. At the same time, and the United Kingdom. At the same time, indeed, the European Union and Switzerland, for example, have minimized the list of active cases up to 0 right now. I have to admit that today, unfortunately, the number of Zimbabwean interlocutors, both public and private, including private individuals, are reporting that their bank accounts are being closed all around the world. They have been requested to withdraw their money. They refer to the problem of doing direct bank transfers, so the direct trade is not possible. Therefore, they have to use different sorts of mediators that make the transactions as well as makes any business longer and more complicated and more costly at the very end. And as a result, Zimbabwe is facing serious problems in the economic sector. It faces serious problems as concerns the delivery of the essential infrastructure equipment and spare parts, as well as a number of medicine and other essential goods. Therefore, the multiple problems as for the access to clean water have been reported. Zimbabwe is facing multiple incidents of cholera and problems as concern the treatment of COVID-19 cases because of the absence of running water in the majority of places. It faces some impediments in function of other elements of critical infrastructure as well.
The US-led unilateral sanctions on Zimbabwe were reportedly meant to target individuals and selected organizations, but that has not been the case. Over-compliance with sanctions has increased the suffering of ordinary people who are now bearing the brunt of the sanctions. A Zimbabwean activist believes her country is unfairly targeted by Western countries over alleged human rights abuses.
Rule of law can never be defined in precise terms anywhere in the world. So some of these issues, they talk of human rights abuses. People are killed every day in USA. A lot is happening in all those countries that sanctioned us, but they are not under sanctions. So what's so special about Zimbabwe?
Now, the list of designated individuals and companies is very limited, yet it appears over-compliance with these unilateral sanctions is hurting ordinary Zimbabweans. Can you elaborate on that, please?
This impact is exacerbated enormously by the practice of over-compliance from the side of banking system and from the side of the third country companies. I have been repeatedly reported about the multiple cases when the banks are deciding to close their bank accounts or reject to do any bank transfer as soon as the recipient or a sender is identified as being Zimbabwean, as a national, or being registered in Zimbabwe when we speak about companies. The same refers to the situations of companies which reject to trade directly with Zimbabwean companies as well as Zimbabwean individuals. There are several statements when, for example, some Zimbabwean scholars have reported that they suddenly became ineligible for a number of research projects they used to be eligible for.
Zimbabwean president has expressed hope that dialogue with the European Union will remain constructive and proceed in the spirit of equal partnership, while Britain and the United States have maintained an intransigent position towards Zimbabwe. President Mnangagwa is optimistic on the removal of these illegal sanctions following the recommendation by the UN Special Envoy.
We remain optimistic that their findings and recommendations will facilitate a positive outcome and bring relief to the people of Zimbabwe from the debilitating and unjustified coercive measures and illegal sanctions.
Now, do you see the sanctions being lifted anytime soon, and what needs to be done to see that happening?
I need to say that there is already some positive developments as concern the application of sanctions against Zimbabwe. In particularly, as I have already mentioned, the European Union and Switzerland have minimized the list of active cases of sanctions up to 0. And as I see, there is an attempt to enhance cooperation as well as enhance the level of investments to Zimbabwe and to restore the cooperation possibilities. I hope that the same track will be chosen by other sanctioning states, including the United States. I need to say that I had a very productive meetings with the diplomatic community in Zimbabwe, and the content of these discussions it basically gives me some hope that the situation will improve. Naturally, I hope very much that the relations between the sanctioning states and Zimbabwe will develop on the base of the rule of law and on the base of the humanitarian assessment of any unilateral measures taken. That's why I believe in this sphere we can hope for the better development.
The sanctions on Zimbabwe were imposed when the country embarked on land reforms, which saw thousands of white commercial farmers vacating land they occupied during the colonial era. This land was given to landless black Zimbabweans who are the original owners of the land. For Western imperialist countries, this move was contrary to what they claim is the rule of law.
Now, our last question to you. We see the sanctioning states talking a lot about the rule of law and rules-based international order. What kind of law would allow violating of the people's basic rights, as we see in the case of these unilateral sanctions?
That's a very complicated question. Unfortunately, the world community didn't face much of unilateral sanctions before. And today what we are facing is basically the use of various sorts of terminology which doesn't look to be very precise from the point of the legality. I believe that it's necessary to look at this problem from the different perspective. We have a problem. We have a huge political discrepancy as concerns the approach to this problem, and people's lives are affected because of the application of unilateral sanctions. And now it's necessary to use the rule of law and the general agreement about the need to promote and protect human rights to be able to bring international relations in this sphere back to normal.
Well, thanks a lot, Alina Dohan, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures. We now take a short break, and when we come back, we shall see how US-based multinationals dominating the global chocolate industry are supporting modern-day slavery in West African cocoa farms. Don't go away.
Child labor in cocoa farms.
According to some statistics, at least 1.56 million children, many as young as 5, are working as slaves and child laborers harvesting cocoa for chocolate in Ivory Coast and Ghana.
Those two West African countries together supply nearly 70% of the world's cocoa beans, the raw ingredient for chocolate bars made by US-based multinationals such as Hershey, Mars, Cargill and Nestle. One of the affected boys who managed to escape in Ivory Coast says he worked as a slave in the country's cocoa plantations.
To discuss the use of children as slaves and laborers in West African cocoa plantations, my colleague contacted Anthony Fountain, the managing director of the Voice Network, a watchdog and catalyst for reformed cocoa sector. Mr. Fountain started by expressing his opinion on how chocolate companies in the world are part of modern-day slavery in West African cocoa farms.
There's a lot of conversation around slavery in the chocolate sector. I think that numerically speaking, that's closer to about 13,000 children that are probably being forced into child labor. The bigger problem in numbers is what we call the worst forms of child labor, where we see more than 1 million children working under the worst forms of child labor, which is dangerous child labor on the cocoa farms in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. That's different than slavery, but it's still shocking and it really needs to be addressed.
The current use of child slaves and laborers in cocoa farms is the legacy of the evil era of colonial rule. Unfortunately, 6 decades after independence, Western multinationals are still looting and plundering Africa's resources while poverty lingers across the continent. Poverty is a vicious cycle in these cocoa-producing countries as kids, just like their parents, are forced to work in plantations due to grinding poverty.
I stopped going to school when I was 10 years old. When my parents didn't have enough money, I went out and helped them by working in the field.
Now, the issue of slavery and child labor in cocoa plantations has been discussed for decades, but there is no solution in sight. Can you say that capitalism motivated by greed is the source of this economic crime?
The reason why this problem remains the way it is because for the large chocolate companies, this system works very well. For the farmers and for their children and for the nature around them, it doesn't work very well. And I think that it's possible to have a sustainable supply chain, but for that to happen, there need to be consequences for economic and environmental and human rights violations. And currently, there aren't any consequences for it. As I sometimes like to call it, the reason we haven't solved the problems yet is we didn't have to. There are simply no consequences for the multinationals for when they destroy the planet and the people that are actually growing their cocoa. And until there will be consequences, until they are made to change, they won't change.
Now, following global outcry over child slavery, Western multinationals in the chocolate industry took a different approach.
They teamed up with various stakeholders to create the Harkin-Engel Protocol, which effectively quelled the 2000-2001 campaign. But they had no intention of stopping this evil exploitation of African children, as it would greatly reduce their profits. The cocoa industry ratified the Harkin-Engel Protocol and committed to reduce the most hazardous forms of child labor by 70% by 2020. Yet, top cocoa-producing countries are still grappling with child labor and slavery. Now, the question is, was the ratification of this protocol a mere public relations gimmick?
I think that when the Harkin-Engel, first the protocol and then later the Harkin-Engel framework, as it was later called, when that got started, it was really a means for the chocolate companies to avoid bad publicity and to avoid regulatory developments. They made a promise so that they wouldn't get a law. I think you can put it as simple as that. Over the years, I think people working for the companies have really wanted to solve the problem, but so far we haven't seen any serious impact. We haven't seen any serious results yet. in dealing with the concept of child labor in cocoa.
6 young boys between the ages of 12 and 14 from the impoverished African nation of Mali were taken from their homes and enslaved on Ivory Coast cocoa plantations. After their stories became known, in 2005, international human rights lawyers sued Nestle USA and Cargill, which profited from the forced labor.
The case was brought before the U.S. Supreme Court, and as expected in June this year, the court issued a verdict in favor of these U.S.-based multinationals. We asked Mr. Fountain to give us his take on the verdict by the American court.
I am not an American lawyer or judge, so I'm not quite sure how far I can go to make a valid statement on that. But it's my impression that we need better laws before we can actually get justice. I think we really need to make sure that the laws that we have in place, that they are finally going to be good enough, that the laws say to companies, to multinationals, you are not allowed to profit off the back of child labor, deforestation, and extreme poverty. And as long as the law allows that kind of exploitation to happen, I'm not very hopeful that lawsuits will be very effective.
In Ghana, 59% of children in cocoa-growing households were in child labor and 55% in hazardous child labor in 2018 and 2019. The government there is engaged in plans to rectify the situation, as this labor official explains.
Government works through community partners because child labor is in the communities. It works with the chiefs, it works with opinion leaders, it works with the district assemblies, the children themselves, and is able to create partnership with them, saying that the community owns the problems themselves and are able to address it.
Now, governments in cocoa-producing countries have clearly failed to take enough action aimed at ending exploitation of their citizens by these multinationals in the cocoa industry. Can we hope that the situation will change for the better in future?
We're starting to see quite some hopeful movements there. The Ivorian and Ghanaian governments over the last 2 years have started to work together to try, for example, to drive up the prices for cocoa, because poverty is one of the key drivers to all of the problems that we have in the cocoa supply chain, whether it's child labor, gender inequality, deforestation. All of it is driven by poverty. And we're seeing the Ivorian and Ghanaian governments work together quite strongly to move the prices up, to start addressing these issues. But changing problems that are as deep and as fundamental as this will not happen overnight. And so I think we need to have to be patient, we have to be persistent, and we also have to continuously be looking at how can we do better than we are doing now. But the governments are starting to work on it, and they have a very important role to play, and there's a long way to go also there.
Well, that's the dark side of the chocolate industry. So every time you enjoy that chocolate bar, remember that child slavery might have been involved in the production process. Do your part and stop modern-day slavery perpetrated by greedy chocolate producers, mostly based in the United States. And on that note, we come to the end of this week's edition of Africa Today. Send us your comments through our social media handle and let us know what you think about today's show. You can also watch today's episode by visiting our website, presstv.ir. From me, Mubarak Kenya, it's goodbye for now.